Come on, mute. And we'll start out this morning with roll call. Aaron Ashley. Laura Feldman.
Here.
Jim Doherty.
Here.
Mia Burke.
Here.
Brett Gamba. Brett Levy. Okay. Senator Gorsuch. Senator Hensel. Timothy Seymour.
Here.
Stephen Bedrick.
Here.
Tom Roberts. Mike Freeman.
Here.
Matty Stitzel. So we'd like to welcome Mike and Maddie to the board. This is their first meeting. They were recently appointed by the governor, so congratulations.
Thank you.
Also like to thank the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla for hosting us today. And we will have public at the end of the meeting around 2:30 this afternoon. Also, would like to introduce any agency personnel. So if we get started over here with you, Matt.
I'm Matthew Hendrickson, Oregon Department of Energy, active waste remediation specialist. Tom Cecilia with Oregon Department of Energy. I'm the Hanford hydrogeologist.
Sarah saying Oregon Department of Energy. I'm an ecologist.
Max Woods, Assistant Director, Oregon Department of Energy for Nuclear Safety and Emergency Preparedness.
And
Mark Reese.
sorry, Mark.
Okay.
And Stephanie, the agency personnel on right, if you guys could introduce yourself.
Stephanie Schlein, Washington State Department of Ecology Nuclear Program. I'm the program director.
I'm Ryan Miller, I'm the communications manager for Department of Ecology.
Gary Younger, DOE.
Okay, do we have any agency personnel online who'd like to introduce themselves?
Yeah, good morning, Brian Stickney, Deputy Manager at Office of River Protection and Richland Operations Office.
Hi, I guess I can go. We'll round out some of the DOE folks. Mark Silverstein, Hanford Chief Counsel.
Rich Buell, Acting Department of Communications Manager, Department of Energy.
Delaware Oasis Manager for the Tank Waste Mission.
Hi, I'm Teresa Howell, Washington State Department of Ecology Section Manager.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Dahl, the Tank Waste Treatment Section Manager for the Washington State Department of Ecology. And I apologize that my camera's not working.
Good morning, I'm Jeff Tyree with the Department of Energy's Hanford Office of Communications.
Okay, thank you very much for those introductions. We would like to begin now with technology.
Stand up.
Okay, hang on one second more.
I want to start by sharing that a couple of years ago, I was honored to attend a memorial here at the tribal longhouse, and for Art McConnell, Koyama, Cougar, White Mountain Lion, Nini Boo, spiritual elder, veteran, and healer. I met Art when he served on the executive steering committee for the Portland Harbor Community Coalition, where he helped guide the vision of the coalition's work on the Portland Harbor Superfund site. He often opened monthly meetings and other gatherings with a prayer, led sacred water ceremonies for the river, and ensured the perspectives and rights of Northwest tribal traditions and expectations were uplifted in our work. I also remember him saying once, you can talk to the river, you can talk to the river listens. We respectfully acknowledge that our advocacy, activism, and learning take place on lands we inhabit, throughout Oregon and Washington, cared for by the indigenous peoples since time began. The Hanford nuclear weapons site encompasses culturally significant lands belonging to the Wanapum, the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakama Nation, the Confederated Tribes of the Reservation, the Nez Perce Tribe, and Spokane Indian Reservation. We recognize the pre-existing and continued sovereignty of these tribes. We acknowledge the economic and social values, including systemic racism, classism, and the disregard for Indigenous Black and immigrant communities that made harm to this place possible. From the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla, these words: the water was created first, life and land created next. Land promised to take care of all life promised to take care of the land. We pay our respects to the elders and uplift the change makers of today who continue to share their wisdom and traditional ecological knowledge with us to care for one another and these lands and waters. We commit to working towards cleanup and restoration of the Hanford site that is based on future tribal use and stewardship of these lands and these waters. We are honored to be guests here.
Thank you, Laura. So the overriding theme of today's meeting is a review of the holistic negotiations which were recently completed by the agencies. We'll get an update next from the Confederated Tribes on their environmental work on site. And then we will segue into perhaps for the state of Oregon, the most important or most interesting part of today's agenda, and that's we'll start talking about waste transportation and emergency preparedness. Followed toward the end of the meeting by some board business, including a perspective or review of the bylaws. So without further ado, we're going to move into the next item on the agenda, holistic negotiations. And our first speaker is Brian Stickney with the Department of Energy.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you. Appreciate the time today. Since we've already done some introductions, and in the interest of time and leaving a lot of time for questions, I'll just share here some opening remarks. The collective team here of the tri-party agencies is really excited to share the results of the holistic negotiations. This was after 4 years of negotiations with EPA, State of Washington, and Energy, and over 100 sessions during those 4 years. We do have alignment on a plan that lays out an achievable path forward that will enable us to advance the tank waste mission here at Hanford. And so we're here today to provide you a briefing on the details of that and answer any questions you might have on that agreement, which we released publicly on April 29th, and the public comment period will begin here at the end of the month. Personally, I'm really proud of the hard work and partnering by all the teams throughout this process. This was not easy for any of the agencies. And while the agreement is an advantage for all of us to proceed with the mission with certainty, perhaps more importantly is the relationships built over these last years, I think are perhaps more important and will impact future mission success here at Hanford. Really highlighting those areas where we're all aligned, which is let's clean up the site. I'll add that in my 15 years here at Hanford, I've never seen a more collaborative working relationship between the department, our regulators, the community, the states, the tribal nations, and we're all going to have our disagreements because we're all coming at things from different lenses. But where we're focused on our shared mission objectives of risk reduction rather than those minor differences, I think we can lift mountains. And so this alignment and those relationships and the positive momentum on the site, where we have 2 hot melters, we're treating tank waste at industrial scale through TSCR, groundwater continues to treat over 2 billion gallons a year, and a lot of risk reduction work is happening. All of this allows us to continue to be investment worthy from the Congress and allows us to continue to accelerate the Hanford cleanup mission, resulting in benefits to the workers, the public, and the environment and all the citizens of the Pacific Northwest. And so I did want to hand off at this point to Stephanie Schleif, the new Nuclear Waste Program Manager for Washington's Department of Ecology, for any opening remarks from her.
Thanks, Brian. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me online if I talk.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, well, I was also just handed a microphone, so I'll use both. Hopefully you can hear me extra well this morning. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here in person with you at the board meeting. Really appreciated the tour yesterday as well as the dinner, getting to know you all a little bit more. As Brian said, I'm the new Nuclear Waste Program Manager for Washington State Department of Ecology. I took on that role a little over 2 months ago now. It's been a whirlwind. With me, I have quite a few folks who helped out on the, about 4 years of mediated negotiations that we had related to the holistic agreement. Teresa Howell, who you met, Suzanne Dahl, who you met, and then Ryan Miller, who works our communications. We're all here to help answer any questions that you have. I didn't get a chance to introduce, but is online, Andy Fitz, who represents the state interests with the Attorney General's office, who you will hear from a little later in the presentation. We are really excited to be here with you. As I said, after about 4 years of mediated confidential dialogue between the tri-party agencies, we recognize the agreement as a huge achievement. And it really, we think, lays out a durable framework that shows alignment and accelerates work in a way that ensures a safe tank waste retrieval and treatment mission. We look forward to sharing details with you this morning. And as I said, Andy Fitz will be speaking to the presentation along with Mark Silverstein. And I didn't get a chance to see, this is usually where I pass it off to EPA. Is Tim Hamlin or Michelle Mullen on? And do you have any opening remarks?
So.
You didn't see him?
I don't see Tim or Michelle on. Is it coming over to me unless someone from EPA is planning some opening remarks?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Interrupt for just a moment. I would like to welcome Senator Hansel and Representative Levy just joined the meeting, and Senator Hansel, this may be your last meeting. I guess we want to thank you very much for your support for this organization.
I did that. I apologize for being late. I had some party cup, I just got hung up this morning.
Okay.
To be in here in my district.
Great. Thank you. Back to you, Brian.
Mark?
I think it's coming over to me. So hello again, Mark Silverstein, Department of Energy, Hanford Site Chief Counsel. We're going to walk through the presentation today along with my co-host, Andy Fitz from the Washington Attorney General's office. For some of you, I think this might be like your second or third iteration of this. So, I apologize. You're going to hear it again, but we'll walk through it. And for those that are new, we're excited to have the opportunity. We appreciate your time today. Next slide, please. So we're here to talk to you about the holistic agreement. And as Brian mentioned, it's the culmination of 4 years of work. In one sentence, I would summarize the holistic agreement as, setting us on a course for the Hanford tank waste retrieval and treatment mission for the next 15 to 20 years. That's kind of your one sentence summary. And what we're going to give you today, I used to call it the movie trailer or preview, but since we put the public agreement out for, all of you to read in its 100 pages of glory, today I'm calling it the Cliff Notes version. So we're going to give you a summary of what's in that agreement that's been put out now for review and for which the public comment period will be starting soon. And as Brian and Stephanie spoke to, we think that overall this proposes a safe, realistic, and achievable course for a significant portion of the Hanford cleanup mission going forward. Next slide, please.
So good morning. I'm Andy Fitz from the Washington AG's office. And as Brian and Stephanie said at the start, we're happy to be in a place where we've reached agreement, but we were not in the same place around this time in 2020 when we started negotiations. We had multiple different threads of potential litigation. The Department of Energy had provided notice to the state of Washington that it was there were milestones at risk under the consent decree that governs construction and initial operation of the waste treatment plant, primarily around the pre-treatment facility lagging behind. And then we also had a number of brewing disputes and potential missed milestones under the tri-party agreement that were largely based on the WTP being operational. So if it was delayed, those PPA deadlines were also going to be delayed. So rather than have, multiple different venues and lawsuits going on concurrently, the tri-parties thought it would be a better approach to see if we could come together and talk about all of these interrelated issues in one sit-down session, which is where the term holistic negotiations came from. It was a lot of effort. We had more than 100 mediation sessions, but just about a year ago, we announced reaching a conceptual agreement. And then it takes time to convert those ideas to actual legal proposals. So we worked on that over the next 11 months or so, and we're able to put out for public comment the package that Mark mentioned. The negotiations were confidential because they were subject to a federal mediation, but we did have several documents that came out while we were in mediation that informed our efforts that were very helpful. One was an analysis of alternatives that the Department of Energy commissioned to look at different ways to move forward with high-level waste treatment, particularly with the pre-treatment facility being behind schedule and over budget. There were system plans, what are called system plans, produced under the tri-party agreement that look at different scenarios for optimizing retrieving waste from tanks and getting it treated. And then there's something called the Test Bed Initiative, which is a pilot project for routing some portion of low activity tank waste and sending it offsite for disposal. That both had an environmental assessment, an EPA assessment, and an EPA variance from RCRA requirements that was pretty important to our negotiation, as we'll talk about a little bit later. Next slide, please.
So you've heard the phrase holistic negotiations, holistic agreement. What does it all mean? What is it exactly? The holistic agreement is three parts, which I'm going to get to in just a moment. But first, from a high level, some of you are familiar with this. There's two primary legal doctrines that govern the work that we do at the Hanford site. One is the consent decree. The other is the tri-party agreement, or TPA. There's others, but those are kind of your two key ones. So when we talk about the holistic agreement, we're talking about three parts. And this is what was posted on April 29th for your review. Number one is proposed amendments to the consent decree. Number two is proposed changes to the tri-party agreement, or TPA. The vehicle we use to effectuate that is called a change control form, or a change package. So when you're looking at the holistic agreement online, you'll see there's a series of change control forms listed as attachments. That's what we're talking about there as part two. And the third is a settlement agreement document, which, in addition to a variety of standard legalese language, has some other related provisions and commitments in it, which we're going to talk to. So what we're going to do is go through each of the three respective parts to the holistic agreement and talk a little bit more detail about what's in each component. I mentioned earlier that I would summarize the holistic agreement as setting a course for the next 15 to 20 years. In general, if you wanted to associate a time frame for the holistic agreement, it's basically now through 2040. And within that, there's some more near-term commitments and there's some longer-term commitments, but that's your general time frame that governs the holistic agreement. Next slide, please. So first, we'll start with the highlight reel. Number one, we think it's important to reaffirm that this agreement maintains the existing timeframes for the initial operation of both the low activity waste facility and the high level waste facility. So that's the hot commissioning milestones for both of those respective facilities. However, we are proposing to pursue a direct feed approach for high-level waste treatment, similar to what you may have heard called DF law, direct feed low activity waste. We're proposing a direct feed approach for the initial high-level waste treatment mission as well. In addition, associated with the high-level waste treatment mission overall, that will involve building a waste transfer vault and a second effluent management facility. Next slide, please.
So continuing the highlights, there are a few single shell tanks that are in the scope of the consent decree that are still to be retrieved, but we reached agreement on the next set of tanks to be retrieved moving forward under the tri-party agreement. It would be 22 tanks from the 200 West area of Hanford to be retrieved by 2040. The highlight here is that the low activity waste portion of waste retrieved from those tanks, there's currently not a way of moving that waste from the west side of Hanford to the waste treatment plant complex on the east side of Hanford. So it would be put into a grout form for offsite disposal. And by offsite, it would be outside the state of Washington at a facility in Utah or Texas. Further highlights, DOE commits to designing and constructing 1 million gallons of new multi-purpose tank waste storage capacity, and also evaluating new technologies for retrieving waste from difficult to retrieve tanks. And then finally has indicated that it will refrain from applying a high-level waste interpretation at Hanford. This is something the state of Washington was concerned about and had legal objection to. And we found other ways of working around how to reclassify high-level waste. That's where that EPA variance comes in, and we'll talk about that a little bit further. Next slide, please.
Okay, so we're going to start now with the first of the 3 parts of the holistic agreement, which is the proposed changes to the consent decree. So for the low activity waste facility, you know, there's a lot more in here coming up about the high level waste facility and certain pre-treatment functions. But as far as law goes, I already mentioned we're not changing the hot commissioning milestone for that facility. Many of you are familiar that that was extended back in 2022 for work impacts associated with the pandemic. So that's your most recent sort of schedule adjustment associated with that milestone. However, we are moving up the initial operation milestone for 3 years after the facility hot commissioning. That's in part because of the way the consent decree is currently structured, where it had simultaneous operation of the entire waste treatment plant. That's the 3 major components: the high level waste, pretreatment, and low activity waste facility. We've essentially bifurcated that function to move it up and be associated with the hot commissioning milestone. Next slide, please. I think this is me as well. Okay. High level waste facility. So I already mentioned, and I think this is kind of one of the more significant items of the holistic agreement, pursuing a direct feed configuration for the initial operation of the high level waste facility, similar to DF law. And in conjunction with, you know, executing that mission, we will be constructing 2 additional facilities. One is the effluent management facility, and the other is a waste transfer vault. And as we said, the commissioning date, the hot commissioning date for the high level waste facility remains the same, but this one maybe have some subtle adjustment later after we have developed a critical path schedule, although at this time it's not anticipated to change greatly. The parties will discuss that at a later date. For now, the date stays the same. Next slide, please.
So if, as Mark mentioned, the timeframes remain the same for starting treatment of low activity waste and starting treatment of high level waste in a direct feed approach, you know, you might ask, well, what did change? And it's really related to that pre-treatment facility that was the source of the at-risk notification back in 2019. And basically what the parties are doing is moving ahead with some of the functions of the pre-treatment facility to support direct feed high level waste. That's where that waste transfer vault and effluent management facility come into play. while holding off on putting into place the sort of the final steps of pretreatment that really lead to efficiency in treating the high level waste part. It's not really necessary to produce high level waste, but if you strip the chemicals out of the waste, you do not need to produce as many canisters of glass that need to go off site for deep geologic disposal. But we've chosen to hold off on sort of right sizing that function until we get to the point of actually starting up the high level waste treatment. And then we will insert milestones into the consent decree at that time for finishing out that final pretreatment function. We expect that to happen around the 2038 timeframe when that negotiation occurs. So really the big change is putting off those final pretreatment functions until after direct feed high level waste starts up. That's also the time when we will reset the milestones in the consent decree for achieving what we call full-scale operations of all the waste treatment plant functions. Right now, those are supposed to hit sort of the consent decree standard for initial operations operating efficiency in 2036, but that efficiency will not probably be achieved until those final pretreatment functions are put into place. So we reset those dates at the same time we populate the consent decree with milestones for those pretreatment functions. Next slide, please. So then finally, under the consent decree, I mentioned a minute ago that there are a few single shell tanks that the consent decree calls on to be retrieved. There are only a handful remaining. They're all in the A and AX tank farms. The dates for retrieving those tanks have not been changed with two exceptions, and that's for tanks A104 and A105, both of which are difficult to retrieve tanks. And we are putting off the date for retrieving those two tanks while there is a concurrent effort under the tri-party agreement to develop new tank retrieval technologies, with some hope that those new retrieval technologies might be able to come into play with A104 and A105. The Department of Energy does have the option of substituting two tanks just to close out its consent decree obligation. If that happens, then A104 and A105 move into the tri-party agreement still with retrieval obligations, so they don't go away. Next slide, please. So the tri-party agreement, as I mentioned at the outset, has some end dates for completing the retrieval of all the tanks, closing all the tank farms, and treating all the tank waste. Right now, those dates are 2040, 2043, and 2047. We know those dates are not achievable right now because they really depend on having an operational waste treatment plant. But rather than reset those dates, which would be somewhat arbitrary, we've basically held them in place until we have better information, at which point they will be then revised to designate the new deadlines for completing these major parts of the Hanford cleanup. So that negotiation to reset those deadlines will happen at the same time that we put those pretreatment milestones in the consent decree and change the ultimate consent decree dates for getting full waste treatment plant operation. It just makes sense to make all those decisions at the same time based on common information and better information than we have today. So they have not gone away, and we retain language in the consent decree that says, even though we recognize that the dates that are in the TPA are not achievable, the Department of Energy still needs to move forward with retrieving tanks and treating tank waste as expeditiously as possible. And we have a whole set of milestones between now and 2040, going slightly past the time when these dates are reset, that have detailed interim steps that the Department of Energy is obliged to achieve. I think that covers everything on this slide. Next slide, please. So one other aspect of change to the tri-party agreement, there is something called system plan negotiations that were created in the 2010 settlement that included the consent decree. And basically, this is looking at the whole tank waste mission. You run different simulations of how to sort of sequence and stage things to optimize efficiency and getting tanks retrieved and tank waste treated. Initially, we had negotiations around that with certain topics like, do we need to revise the end dates? Do we need more tank capacity? What tanks get retrieved next on an every 6-year rotation? But we've moved up a couple of those topics to be negotiated every 3 years. One of the topics is defining the set of tanks to be retrieved over the next 8-year period. So it gets a little complicated, but every 3 years, we'll be designating an 8-year forward-looking roster of tanks to be retrieved. So when we talk about the 22 tanks to be retrieved between, basically, late 2020s to 2040, this will be the negotiation where we say, okay, here are the specific tanks to be retrieved in a short-term time frame. The other topic we'll talk about every 3 years is whether we need additional contingency actions, including the possible need for new tank capacity. Everything else that is subject to system plan negotiation remains on the every 6-year rotation. So we talk about tank retrieval and contingency actions every 3 years, and every 6 years, sort of the every other system plan negotiation, we address all the topics. Next slide.
Okay, so we talked about the holistic agreement addressing not only the high-level waste facility and pretreatment functions, but also tank retrieval. So as Andy mentioned, we're currently in the ANAX farms at our site doing retrievals under the consent decree. What we talked about was what are the next farms to be retrieved after we're done with ANAX. And so that agreement outlines 22 tanks by 2040 from the S, SX, and U farms, which is in the west area of our site. And the plan for this is that the tanks will be retrieved. They will go through some form of, it's important to mention this, pre-treatment function similar to like a TISCR type pre-treatment, and grouted for offsite disposal. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment when we get into alternative treatment. What this allows is for work to go on in the west area of our site, which is actually 7 miles from east area where the WTP is and where the east area tank farms are, independent of the waste treatment plant operations while it'll be processing waste from the east area tanks. In addition, we had one tank, which I like to call a lonely A farm tank, A103, that wasn't currently required to be retrieved under the consent decree. It's the one remaining A farm tank in the tri-party agreement. We're simply adjusting the schedule for that milestone to better align with the retrieval sequence of the other tanks in that farm, in the A farm, that are currently required to be retrieved under the consent decree. So I'm a lawyer, I'm not great at math, but if you can add up the currently remaining consent decree tanks, the 22 tanks, and A103, that's 29 tanks by 2040 is the math on that. Since we have several engineers and scientists in the room, I know you love this stuff. Next slide, please. So I mentioned alternative treatment, which for all intents and purposes, we're talking about grout. By the end of 2024, we're going to select the way in which the 22 tanks will be treated. We have not yet decided whether that treatment is local in the state of Washington, if you will. We know that disposal will be out of state. That's one of the specific conditions that will be either in Texas or Utah. But as far as where it's actually treated, immobilized in grout, we haven't yet picked whether that's local or at the respective treatment facility. The test bed initiative, by way of comparison, I think you're all very familiar with this. That's 1,000 gallons going to Utah and 1,000 gallons going to Texas to be treated and disposed of there. So we haven't yet picked where the treatment aspect of the 22 tanks will take place. Just trying to draw some distinctions to make sure we're being clear. So I mentioned the condition that's specific to the fact that this alternative treatment and the 22 tanks that are grouted have to be disposed of out of the state of Washington. We have other conditions in there. One, for example, is what we call just-in-time production or scaling, which means that we can't generate more waste than we can reasonably ship so that we don't have a backlog at the site. These conditions remain in place through at least 2040, and then we will meet later on. We'll get together with ecology to discuss whether or not any future conditions are warranted. Next slide.
So one of the highlights that we mentioned is new tank capacity. So Energy commits to building 1 million gallons of new storage capacity. This will be in the 200 West area of Hanford, where I think the parties were able to reach agreement that there's probably the greatest near-term need for additional capacity. We don't yet know exactly what that capacity will look like. It could be one big 1 million gallon double shell tank, could be a series of smaller double shell tanks. It could be some other storage configuration that sort of makes the sense for how to most efficiently, take care of retrieved waste or provide emergency space or whatnot in the 200 West area. That's going to be analyzed in an analysis of alternatives the Department of Energy will commission. And the Department of Ecology will have a role in that AOA with insight and input into that process. Next slide, please. We also mentioned the new retrieval technology. This is part of the reason why we put off the retrieval deadlines for those 2 tanks in the consent decree, A104 and A105, both of which are difficult to retrieve. But one of the things that we tried to address moving forward with a longer tank retrieval timeframe is to have better technologies for retrieving tanks that either are, largely dry, so you need to just go in and sort of dry mine waste, or tanks that are leak prone, where they aren't really subject to sluicing technology that introduces a lot of liquid into the tanks. So Energy will convene an expert panel to provide analysis and recommend new retrieval technologies to the Department of Energy. Energy is then obliged to take at least 2 of those technologies forward, or at least 2 technologies forward, into a phased development process. Sort of a stepwise process that starts from, pilot scale to eventual field testing. This expert panel also is tasked with taking a look at salt well pumping as a potential response for actively leaking single shell tanks, looking at the body of information there and deciding whether it's something that might be practicable. Next slide, please.
Okay, so rounding out the second part of the holistic agreement, the tri-party agreement, TPA changes. We have 2 new interim milestones to activate the cross-site transfer lines, which again run between west area of our site, about 7 miles, to the east area of the site. They're a means to move tank waste from west to east. So we have 2 new milestones to activate those cross-site lines. Additionally, there's a change package associated with, it's not a new milestone to establish the high-level waste storage facility that was already on the books, but we have some interim milestones associated with the development of a project schedule. So that's one of the other change packages that you'll see. And lastly, we have a milestone to develop and to deliver to the Washington State Department of Ecology the closure plans or closure documentation for all of the remaining waste management areas at our site to assist in the state's permitting efforts. Next slide, please. So the third component of the holistic agreement, we mentioned the settlement agreement. And as you saw, the bulk of the substance is really in the proposed changes to the consent decree and the TPA. However, the settlement agreement does have a couple of important things that we wanted to highlight. Number one, this says not subject to public comment. I don't want to create confusion here. We put the settlement agreement out with the other two components of the holistic agreement. It is for all intents and purposes done, but we thought it was important that, the public, stakeholder groups, tribes, et cetera, have all 3 components to the holistic agreement to inform your review of the consent decree and the TPA parts that we've just spent some time walking through. It does include the statement that Andy talked about at the outset during our highlight reel that DOE intends to forbear from exercising the high-level waste interpretation at Hanford. Again, this is specific to the high-level waste interpretation. It's separate from and different from the department's sort of normal process for doing waste classification, such as through a WIR, waste incidental to reprocessing, under DOE Order 435.1. We're specifically talking about the high-level waste interpretation. And lastly, it does include a commitment for DOE and Ecology to discuss off-site grout disposal conditions, if any, after the current condition expires. Next. Oh, and one thing that's not listed on here that I think is important to mention, sorry, before we go to that, the settlement agreement also has a commitment, or at least language, that talks about the department's need to complete applicable regulatory processes, such as NEPA and the National Historic Preservation Act. That language is expressly listed in the settlement agreement. It acknowledges that we have to go through those processes and obviously complete any, requisite NEPA review. Next slide, please.
So the last bullet on this slide addresses what.
Oh, I took your bullet. Sorry, Andy.
But this also, so I think the major thing about the settlement agreement is that in large part, our settlement is agreement to put forward the proposals that we've spent most of the morning talking about. So, the settlement is saying we're going to propose certain things and put them out for public comment and then decide whether to move forward to finalize them. That's the essence of the settlement. The things that Mark mentioned are things that are not necessarily regulatory requirements that the state as a regulator can require of energy, but the parties have nevertheless agreed to, like the forbearance provision, and the couple of other things that are mentioned here. So DOE is also committed to involve ecology in its analysis of alternative efforts that are related to the things that are still to be decided moving forward with the consent decree and tri-party agreement proposals. I mentioned the new tank capacity. Energy is sort of by its own internal orders bound to do an analysis of alternatives. If things reach a certain capital cost, that's going to be the case with the new tank capacity. So Department of Ecology will be involved in energy going through developing its alternatives and moving them forward for decision-making processes. There's also, as Mark said, the conditional language about things that energy has to comply with before committing to the proposals, specifically NEPA, which we think that there's already a pretty robust body of NEPA analysis that covers, things that are already in the scope of the consent decree, tank retrievals, tank waste treatment plant. But energy has to go through and go through the analysis to see if there are any gaps to fill. Also has to comply with the National Historic Preservation Act, which of course involves cultural resource analysis. We also did agree to have a follow-on mediated negotiation to discuss possibly updating a couple of appendices to the tri-party agreement. So one is Appendix H. This is something that was developed when the tri-party agreement was first signed in 1989, and it described a demonstration process for retrieving tanks before any tanks had yet been retrieved. So the parties at that time didn't know how successful retrieval would be. So it sort of outlined a process for doing several test cases to decide how are we going to define tank retrieval criteria? How much waste needs to be retrieved from tanks? That's largely outdated by experience now, retrieving quite a few tanks, and probably could be updated. So we've agreed to take a look at that. Appendix I more generally talks about the tank closure process and has a lot of overlap with Appendix H, so they make sense to talk about in tandem. So we have no commitments at this point. We just agree this is something that probably makes sense to take a look at. And while we're making progress, we might as well take a stab at seeing if we can update those. So that's something that'll kick off probably next month. But the settlement agreement says that we we either reach agreement by the end of the year or, you know, or I'm not quite sure what. That's the commitment. Next slide, please.
All right, so I'm going to speak to the next couple of slides on next steps. Okay. The next couple of slides speak to the next steps for the public process and finalizing the changes. As you heard, I believe Mark talk about, May 30th is the start of the 60-day public comment period on proposed changes to the consent decree and the tri-party agreement. We will be holding regional public meetings in Washington and Oregon, and the locations of those will be announced as we announce the public comment period on May 30th. Next slide, please. We'll continue to have discussions with tribes seeking to consult, whether that be through formal government to government consultation or informal discussions on the changes. We'll complete the public comment period. We'll evaluate all of the comments we receive, respond to those comments. Department of Energy, as Andy and Mark both spoke about, will complete any NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, NHPA assessments, analyses that need to be done. We'll execute proposed amendments then to the consent decree in the federal district court. And then finally, the agencies will sign and implement the proposed TPA agreement provisions. And I think that takes us to the last slide, which is questions for us.
Thank you very much. Having seen a similar presentation a couple of weeks ago with the Hanford Advisory Board, this presentation today is a little more detailed and appreciate the clarification. In particular, the thinking around pre-treatment of high-level waste is a little bit more clear than it was. Before we start Q&A, there's a couple terms in here that are used that I was hoping you could define kind of physically what it means for the board members here. Tank retrieval and tank closure, if you could clarify what that entails. For example, in tank retrieval, is it 100% waste removed from a tank or something less than that? And then in terms of tank closure, the vision, what exactly is that? Is the tank going to remain in place or be removed?
Okay, why don't I take the tank retrieval one, and Ecology may want to address the tank closure. Does that work for you, Andy? So for tank retrieval, 50,000 foot definition we're talking about is removing the contents of a tank from the tank, mainly taking waste out of the older single shell tanks and putting it into our, quote, newer double shell tanks. That's tank retrieval in a nutshell. You asked about how much is removed. The current consent decree and TPA has requirements for the amount of waste that needs to be removed. And so that's currently a deployment of a certain number of technologies working towards a residual waste goal of 360 cubic feet. That's already in the consent decree and in the tri-party agreement. That's what tank retrieval is in a nutshell. Tank closure, I'll hand it over to Ecology.
So I'll just put a little finer point on the tank retrieval criteria. So right now they're defined as reaching limits of technology. And Mark mentioned that there are 2 technologies required under the consent decree. So you take those as far as they will get you in terms of retrieving waste until basically, you know, you're not getting anything anymore. And if that takes you past that 99% by volume figure, then that's fine. I mean, you keep retrieving until you hit that limit. What that Appendix H talked about is, well, I mean, one of the parts of it was what happens if you reach the limits, but you're above that 99% volume. So that's I guess that's sort of a question area to resolve moving forward. From the state standpoint, this is a RCRA, hazardous waste based retrieval process. So it's it's trying to get as much out as possible. It's not necessarily, risk-based to begin with. It's sort of, how far does the technology take you? So the tank closure process, that's addressed in that Appendix I, but it does bring in the question of what happens to the tanks once they've been retrieved. And basically that flips over to Ecology's permitting process. And I know that Stephanie can probably talk about revision 9 of the Hanford site-wide permit that's going to be coming out later this year. But there are a series of closure plans developed that are submitted by Energy to the Department of Ecology that basically outline the way in which Energy proposes to put those tanks into their final disposition. And, in the ideal, there's something called clean closure under RCRA, which is, you dismantle everything and you walk away like it never really occurred. That may not be possible at Hanford. And where that's not possible, you talk about what's called landfill closure, which is you close the tanks in place with protective conditions and landfill covers. Stephanie, I don't know if you want to add anything beyond that.
I can just speak to the Rev 9 piece of that. So Rev 9, the Hanford site-wide dangerous waste permit renewal, probably called Rev 9, will be going out for public comment, we estimate later this year sometime. In that permit, right now we're planning on 120-day public comment. In that permit, the SST system will be included in that. The closure plans are tiered, so there is a tier 1 closure plan that talks about the whole SST system. There'll be a tier closure plan for the waste management area C. Tier 2 is the waste management area closure plans, and then dangerous waste management units or tank bases will have a tier 3 closure plan, and we will have closure plans in there for WMAC in particular for public review. So I think that's probably what I would add.
And I'll just add additionally to what Stephanie was saying, a part of the package that is out there for review is the TPA change packages, which include all of the schedule for receiving those closure plans, which we're speaking to.
Like the rest of the WMA.
And I can say that. Well, we're open for questions from the board and
SST, single shell tank, this is an acronym for everybody, WMA, waste management area, so the grouping of facilities, just so people are aware of it. And maybe just while we're on the point, like important questions, I have a whole list of questions. This is the second time I've heard this presentation, by the way, probably the third for Tom and Matt. It gets more understandable the more you hear, but so there's a lot there. On the tank closure, just since we're talking about it, it sounds like that hasn't been agreed upon, that that's still to be reviewed as one of the appendices, that it's fine. And, or I'm not quite sure if it's also part of the permit, the site-wide permit. But either way, what I hear is that some tanks might actually be removed out of the ground, presumably put into another landfill somewhere else. And some tanks will be left where they are. I also presume they'd be filled with the ground material and then covered up and packed as if they're a little landfill by themselves. So that's kind of what I'm hearing. And maybe that's the simplification of some of the stuff here. There's a lot to it, but since the question was to the floor, I just want to interpret that. That about what it said.
So
I got to be honest, the mic is breaking up. I just want to point that out. It's hard to hear Max if you asked a question. I apologize. I just wanted to clarify. I couldn't hear you.
Okay, thank you.
Matt, hold it closer to your mouth.
Closer to my mouth. Yeah, I just heard my voice. Okay, I was sort of in my meandering way trying to put a point on the tank closure process, if you will, or plan. And what I simplified was that sounds like some tanks will be closed in place, meaning they will probably be filled with ground, probably covered up with a cap, and turned into landfills, so to speak. Some tanks maybe will be taken out of the ground and then put somewhere else, maybe in the landfill, the Earth landfill, for their acronym. I can't remember what it stands for. Under their acronym, offsite. Does that sound about right, Stephanie? Or is that maybe you're not there yet to that point?
So I think you also asked the question, and I want to clarify. The TPA appendices H and I are outside of the permit process. The permit will have closure plans in it that speak to the closure process and the closure, performance standard for each waste management area, each dangerous waste management unit. So like a tank or a series of tank farms. And in Rev 9 for WMAC, there will be closure documentation that speak to how certain tanks or areas will be closed. And I can't speak to the detail of what those closure plans are going to entail. We have a project manager, probably could, but he's not on this call right now, and I don't know if Teresa or Suzanne are more familiar with me. And as Teresa spoke about, we have milestones to get the remainder of the closure plans for the other waste management areas, and we haven't received those yet. So we can't speak to how those other tanks, that decision has yet to be made, and we haven't got this documentation and reviewed it and gone through the process. I just asked if anything I said needs to be clarified by my attorney. Please feel free to chime in, Andy.
It's a little hard to follow. It is choppy, but what I heard sounded all correct to me.
Yeah, and this is Mark from DOE. Some of that question, Max, is a little bit outside the scope of the holistic agreement. So from a holistic agreement perspective, we mentioned that we have a TPA change package for development of the closure plans and closure documentation for ecology's permitting needs. So we can talk more about tank closure, but it wouldn't necessarily be germane to what was negotiated as a part of the holistic agreement. Not that I'm deflecting your question, I'm just noting that it's probably a broader conversation than perhaps what this presentation was geared towards.
Fair enough. Thank you, Mark. Friends.
Put another way, there's no decision made in these proposals to say how tanks are going to be closed.
Right. I mean, I think everyone knows we have a tank closure and waste management EIS ROD that was issued. That's department selected landfill closure. That's different than ecology's permitting decisions and the closure plans that we're going to be submitting. So there's plenty to talk about tank closure, and there's a wealth of existing documentation about the alternatives that were considered for actual closing tanks, but that would be found in the tank closure and waste management EIS and other closure related documentation.
More questions, Mia?
Should I just speak?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we can see if the owl picks you up there.
Can you all hear me online?
Yeah.
So my question is, how many gallons of waste is planned to be grouted from the 22 tanks in 200 West? So if, I know the total of S&SX farm has over 7 million gallons of salt cake and sludge. How much of that volume is planned to be grouted?
I'll have to refer that one to Delmar.
Yeah, so we've identified 22 tanks. The system plan process will go in and define which ones are the tanks and the sequence of the tanks. So how much of that total volume goes through the treatment process, what the total volume will be determined going forward as part of the sequencing. So I really don't have the answer to that. The key is, as both Andy and Mark indicated, that the single shell tank would be retrieved. The law fraction, which is essentially the supernate, would be pre-treated through a cesium removal capability similar to the TISCR, removing 98% of the radioactivity from the material. And then, as we mentioned, that residual material would be what is grouted for offsite disposal. The solids and other materials would retain in the SY farms, but the specific sequence and the exact volume that will represent will be, determined as we go through the processes and part of the 3-year updates of evaluating the sequencing. Part of the process is managing the solids in our SY farms to ensure that we can do the 22 tanks. So short answer is that will be determined as we work through the process and the retrieval sequence.
Laura.
So, said this, you mentioned that this agreement is a done deal. It's not going to be presented to it's not going to go out for comment in public. And I guess that means it's not going to be presented to the public. And so then it is the public's job to go online and read about this and understand it, which seems a bit onerous. So that's the first question. So the disposal.
Maybe I should address the, oh, okay, go ahead. Sorry, couldn't hear the pause there. Did you want me to address the first point, or was there more to your question? I apologize. There was a pause in the microphone.
Well, it's all about public comment, like disposal at facilities outside Hanford, which is very concerning. Is that open for public comment? And
yeah, let me walk through that one more time. So the holistic agreement is 3 parts. The proposed changes to the consent decree, proposed changes to the tri-party agreement, and a settlement agreement. That's the 3 components of the overall holistic agreement. All 3 parts are being put out or have been put out for public review and comment. The changes to the consent decree and the changes to the tri-party agreement are very much proposed at this point for the review and comment by the public, tribes, other stakeholder groups. So, we will be doing as Stephanie noted in the next steps, a response to public comments after the public comment period has closed with respect to the proposed changes to the consent decree and the proposed changes to the tri-party agreement. Does that help clarify?
yeah, it does, I think. What about sending waste offsite to be, disposed of, grouted and or disposed of? Is that going to be a public dialogue?
Yeah, so that change package under the tri-party agreement is a part of what is out for public review and comment.
Okay.
What is known as alternative treatment.
Okay, thank you.
I also want to note that I think Liz Matson had a chat comment that if the tri-parties could provide some bounding, I think, on the volume of waste that might be grouted from the 22 tanks, that would be helpful. I don't have that information, but it seems like that's something that could be developed.
Yeah, Andy, I saw that note. I was going to touch in on it. So the existing material in the single shell tanks is essentially solid. So it's either salt cake or the solid material sludges. The retrieval process dissolves that. So when you dissolve that, the volume goes up significantly. So we're clearly talking amount of offsite disposal in the millions of gallons kind of range, just to give some perspective. And again, we're talking not the TBI, but the 22 tank total volume.
I have a background question. Key point was made about the Department of Energy intending to forbear high-level waste interpretation. What does that mean?
In one word, refrain from applying the high-level waste interpretation at Hanford for purposes of tank waste disposal or tank closure.
Mark, can you explain what the high-level waste interpretation means?
Sure. It's basically, the department's interpretation of what constitutes high-level waste consistent with the Nuclear Waste Policy Act and the Atomic Energy Act. So it's one means by which the department has, under its opinion or perception, if you will, to classify what is and what is not high-level waste. There are other means to do that, as I mentioned earlier, such as going through what we call a WIR process, waste incidental to reprocessing. We're specifically talking about, when we talk about the high-level waste interpretation, that's the definition of what constitutes high-level waste under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act.
This is Max. Let me just say, in my opinion, why that matters for the board. As simple as it can be, high-level waste has to be vitrified, has to be put in wax, and it has to be disposed of permanently at a deep geologic repository, but it doesn't exist. It's not. Then you have many other options for treatment and disposal, including on-site disposal. I mean, that's to be honest about what that means. It's not having to wait to get more options for how it could be treated. So that's why.
That's a follow-up. Yeah. So following up on that, I guess two questions. And one is, it sounds like there is actually a legal definition of what counts as high-level waste, and this agreement just is agreeing to not apply that definition. No, that's not what this means.
So there's a whole host of information about the high-level waste interpretation that's available on Energy's webpage that will probably be helpful to answer some of these fundamental questions about, the department's high-level waste interpretation and what it is. And I would probably suggest I can put that in the chat to refer everyone to it so that you have an easy, accessible resource. With respect to, again, the holistic agreement, what we're talking about is the department intending to refrain from applying that high-level waste interpretation at Hanford for purposes of tank waste disposal or tank closure. And I think, Andy, correct me if I'm wrong on that latter part of that language, but if I recall correctly, I'm trying to speak to it verbatim.
Yeah, no, that's accurate. And I guess I'll take my own stab at trying to fill in the answer. So the Nuclear Waste Policy Act does provide a source-based definition of what constitutes high-level waste. If it's something that's from the, basically a reprocessing byproduct, and of the process for producing defense waste. And I'm paraphrasing here greatly. But the Department of Energy put its own overlay of an interpretation of the language in the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. And I think it's fair to say that the Department of Energy and the state of Washington have different views about whether that overlay is consistent with the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. So rather than litigate that question, we found a different way of moving forward with allowing waste to be grouted and disposed of offsite that both parties are satisfied with, that doesn't implicate that question of Energy's interpretation. So it basically alleviates the need to apply that interpretation at Hanford, at least for the time being, unless Energy changes its mind, and then there's language about what happens if Energy changes its mind. So, the parties found a way of moving forward without having to sort of, be squarely at odds with respect to the legality of that interpretation.
So it sounds like it's about legal labeling and procedural stuff. I assume someone's worrying about the technical details of whether that designation actually matters for what we do with waste and how it's treated. Yes, someone's worrying about that.
Yeah, although I think the state's concern is that the interpretation could be used to leave much more waste at Hanford than the state was comfortable with. So that's kind of the bottom line.
Yeah, and in some ways, this line of questioning is kind of leading us down a path that we expressly intended to avoid. And I think all parties are somewhat celebrating with respect to the holistic agreement, which is, again, finding a way to pursue alternative treatment technologies or alternative treatment for a certain low activity fraction of the waste at Hanford without there being a, litigation or extended discourse over what constitutes high-level waste or the use of the high-level waste interpretation.
So sticking on the question about high-level waste and being an election year, I believe the prior administration was extremely lobbied to consider that. And being an election year, how's that going to impact, especially when it comes to the high-level waste and trying to get something on paper, and also the impacts on the holistic negotiations?
I couldn't, I apologize, I couldn't quite understand the question. It broke up a little bit. I don't know if it did for others.
Oh, it's that one for Columbia River Keeper, and the big thing is on election year, how is it going to affect them? Because in the prior administration, they were extremely lobbied to reconsider high-level waste in case, and being in an election year, how is that going to impact the classification?
Yeah, so again, the commitment that's in the settlement agreement with respect to the department's intent to forbear from exercising the high-level waste interpretation does not detract from either ecology's or DOE's sort of legal authorities or legal positions. We've essentially agreed to disagree. The department intends to forbear from exercising at Hanford so that we can effectuate a path forward for pursuing alternative treatment at the Hanford site, which we think is a good news story and a good component of our agreement. So how that plays in an election year, that's beyond my ability to speak to, but we are certainly, the tri-parties are pleased that we found a pathway to pursue alternative treatment technologies for the low activity fraction of the waste without having to use the high level waste interpretation. I got no audio coming from that end, sir. Oh.
So I'll try and speak at a level that both the technology and the humans can hear. I want to back up to a kind of a 60,000 foot question, because the answer to it seems to weigh in on a lot of these conversations. Do we, in our most hopeful imagination, expect to return the entirety of the Hanford site to a pristine state anytime in the next 10 generations?
Is that a question for us? It's certainly outside the scope of the holistic agreement, but I'll ask if that was expressly directed at.
And the legalese, I guess. So that's whoever deals in physics and chemistry.
So my understanding is that the current strategy is the inner area of the Central Plateau will be industrial commercial zoned. DOE will own that forever. That's the current strategy. There's not a record of decision on that yet. So it's not formally legal that way yet, but that's the strategy. So the rest of the site will be cleared for residential use. So not pristine, but not contaminated to some EPA risk level.
So the entirety of the Hanford site will get back to a point where there is no
except for 11 square miles in the Central Plateau, which is the inner area of the Central Plateau, which would be where the tanks are and the landfills and that type of thing.
So then the second part of the question, the reason I'm asking that is we're talking about reliquefying what is almost solid at this point, thereby creating much more volume. Then we're talking about re-solidifying that by mixing it with concrete, i.e. grout, either on site or shipping that liquid 1,000 miles potentially. Why aren't we considering doing the grouting and keeping it on site rather than spreading that to yet another place and risking accidents in the shipping?
So I'll take a first stab. First, I think that Mark spoke to the fact that the decision is not yet made as to whether liquid would be shipped off of the Hanford site. DOE still has to decide where the grouting would occur, which could potentially be at Hanford, could potentially be nearby Hanford, but off Hanford, or potentially somewhere else. That decision's not made. But I will say that and I'm speaking on behalf of ecology, and Stephanie or Teresa jump in if I misspeak, but I think the Department of Ecology's view is that grouted waste was not acceptable for disposal at Hanford, given the geology at Hanford, that we do not think it's as good as vitrified classified waste. But that doesn't mean it's not appropriate elsewhere. And I think the geology in the Utah and Texas disposal facilities is different from Hanford, where you've got potential infiltration issues and movement to groundwater. You don't have those same concerns at the other two facilities because of their geology. So the state felt comfortable moving forward that way.
Yeah, and this is
Suzanne. Oh, go ahead, Suzanne.
So, yeah, this is Suzanne Dahl from Ecology. Just to add a little detail to what Andy was saying. So the tank closure waste management EIS, along with other risk assessments, have shown that grouting tank waste is not protective of human health and the environment at Hanford. When buried in a landfill that is on top of a gravel dry zone, on top of a very permissive gravel aquifer. So 200 feet seems like a long way, but it's not when it's all gravel. And so you've got the landfill, then you've got 200 feet of dry gravel, and then you have the groundwater underneath that flows to the Columbia River. And so when you look at the risk assessments and the modeling, it's the perspective that that's not protective of the drinking water standards and future use of future generations of that groundwater. And so for that reason, that's our concern at having grouted tank waste buried at Hanford. Just to give you a contrast, the landfill in Texas is located on about 800 feet of clay, which is much less permeable. And the landfill in Clive, Utah is located inside of a basin and range. So it's a cordoned off area. The water doesn't flow outside of that. And the aquifer underneath that is not a usable aquifer. It's not an aquifer that's used by any resource.
Is Ecology and DOE considering the shipment of liquid radioactive waste across the state of Oregon?
I have to ask Delmar to answer that. But one point I did want to make clear, I mentioned this in my remarks, but it's worth mentioning again. The intent here, or the proposal, is not to simply take waste out of a tank and put it into a truck untreated and ship it in a liquid form. It would still undergo a pretreatment function, such as through a cesium removal technology similar to TISCR. So I just want to clarify that so that the impression is not raw tank waste, for lack of a better way of putting it, coming out of a tank, going into a truck, and then being shipped in a liquid form. That's not what's being proposed here. With that, I'll turn it over to Delmar if there's anything to add about routes.
No, I mean, I got nothing to add in terms of routes. Again, we're talking the 22 tanks. The only route discussion is really the testbed initiative is the only ongoing activity at this point.
I might interject in that the National Academy of Science and Engineering Medicine, when they published their study on supplemental low activity waste, one of the primary routes by rail to Clive, Utah only is through Oregon. So.
And
We'll go with that.
Matt had the whole presentation. Time. But Jeff, I think to your point, the answer is yes. Yes, that is under consideration. Be very clear with this.
Here's a question. So what about interim consent-based siting through DOE's Good Energy Collective? They're going to be, they're looking at burying it here, there, and everywhere. Will those sites hold the same criteria as Texas and Utah? And how will they be transported?
I'm not sure I have a response for that question at this time. I don't quite understand. Can you elaborate further on what aspect of the holistic agreement you're speaking to? I apologize.
I think the question is about the consent siting process that's going on right now for spent nuclear fuel storage on an interim basis, and whether this waste would also be subject to storage at that interim facility.
Yes.
The proposal is, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. So what we're proposing with respect to alternative treatment, similar to the test bed initiative, is, again, treatment either locally, we'll say, or at the respective disposal facility. And right now, those facilities are Clive, Utah, or in Texas. That's the respective disposal facilities that we're talking about for this particular waste stream. Those facilities have to be licensed. They have to have a certain waste acceptance criteria to accept our waste. Is that helpful? Which is separate from the consent-based siting, I think, that you're talking about.
It was also mentioned in the plan for formalizing the interim storage of vitrified high-level waste on site. So maybe that plays into it as well.
Okay, Mia, you have a question?
I have a quick question and then a few related to the high-level waste facility. My quick question is, will there be public hearings when the comment period opens, or will it just be public meetings?
I can speak. For the public meetings, we're just planning informational public meetings where we'll do just presentations followed by Q&A, that kind of a style. So we're not going to take formal public comment at the public meetings, but of course you'll be welcome to write any written comment before, during, or after the meetings. So the goal there is to have it be more of a dialogue. Another aspect is the public hearings. During the hearing session of when we do that kind of meeting, we actually can't respond to the comments that are submitted. This we feel allows kind of conversational dialogue where we can actually answer questions from the public.
Great, thank you. And then related to the high-level waste facility, I was wondering if you could tell me when construction on that facility stopped, what year?
Mr. Stickney or Delmar, would you like to address that? I'm not sure that the question might need to be clarified because we're continuing certain activities associated with the construction of the high-level waste facility. So would you like to take that?
Go ahead, Delmar.
Okay, yeah. I mean, we never totally stopped construction on the high-level waste facility. And I'd have to go back and check when we slowed down the progress and focused on the DF law, what date that was. I don't know off the top of my head. The key is what we're doing now is focusing on moving forward with the design activities. So one of the changes in strategies is to complete the design and not pursue concurrent design build with the high-level waste facility to move forward. So the ramp up that we're doing now is really design activities, but in parallel, there are some low risk construction activities occurring as we speak and have been. Obviously, those will be ramping up as we move forward to get the high level waste up by the consent decree dates.
So I'm wondering, can the facility as it's been started and kind of works stopped and then slowly continued, can it be adapted to the new this new direct feed of? Yes.
Yeah, yes. Great question. And I mean, the short answer to that is absolutely. As I think was mentioned, the facility itself and the high level waste configuration is really the same in terms of design. There's some control room changes and things like that, but not really anything affecting the primary processing aspect of the high-level waste facility. As you may know, all of the alternatives we looked at on the project use that high-level waste facility. So most of the modifications are the additional facilities outside of the projects to direct feed it, which is the waste transfer vault, which is kind of a wide spot to be able to ship the high-level waste directly to the high-level waste facility, and eventually some effluent management facility to become more efficient. But yeah, the existing facility and design process is largely unchanged, and that is moving forward as we speak.
And then my final question is, can you tell me a year that the high-level waste facility will start treating actual tank waste?
Again, as I think Andy and Mark mentioned, the existing consent decree dates for those objectives for the high-level waste in the direct feed scenario, recognizing that delta are still our goal and objective. So we're working to the 3336 consent decree dates, and we continue to do that.
So just to clarify, 2036 is when the facility would start treating tank waste. Is that correct?
Actually, the current milestone is 2033. 2036 is to hit that initial operations efficiency, so the ramp up.
Right.
Thanks, Andy, for that clarification.
Just to clarify, though, those are the dates that the presentation said we know aren't feasible right now, right?
The dates that the presentation said are not feasible are, so I'll list them. In the consent decree, it's startup of the full complex, so that includes the pre-treatment functions, all the pre-treatment functions, plus the initial operations of the entire facility. So that's different from starting up the high-level waste facility individually. It's talking about the whole enchilada.
Thank you.
And then in the tri-party agreement, it's the dates for getting all the waste out of the tanks, getting all the tank farms closed, and getting all the waste treated, which really depend on having that, fully functioning waste treatment function that the waste treatment plant provides.
So I have a question about the cross-site transfer line, which sounds like it's 7 miles between east and west. Could you clarify what the transfer rates are? Why you need a pipeline as opposed to moving, 1 or 2 truckloads a day or a week?
So the cross-site lines are existing lines, first off, and they cross-connect our double-tail tank system between east and west. As you may aware, a high-level waste, the true high-level waste fraction, which is one of the lines, the radiological concentration prior to all the pretreatment we're talking about is too high to ship above surface in trucks or other mechanisms. As we execute the mission, that transfer line will transfer the high-level waste portion, which is the non-soluble higher rad portions, to the VIT plant in the east area. So both volume and radiological contents, dictate the traditional underground double encased pipe transfer lines. So they're consistent with the transfer rates that have been used, throughout the tank farm's history. The only time surface shipments, in terms of tanks and trucks, is when we get into the, as we've been talking about here, the supernate and remove the cesium through the Tisker. At that point, it's very low radiation and is easily transported in truck. But prior to that level of treatment, the underground transfer lines is the primary connections between the double shell tanks on the west and the double shell tanks on the east.
So the sludge is consistency of chunky peanut butter made with some gravel mixed in. How confident are we that a pipeline can transport peanut butter?
Well, that peanut butter has been transported in these lines for 40 or 50 years, so we're very confident. We've been doing it for a long time. It involves, as we've been talking about here, a lot of additional water to reduce the solids concentration to an amount that can be maintained in suspension. So the pipes are designed and sized to keep flow rates up, so all those solids stay suspended and we can move it forward. So, we do those kinds of transfers between tanks now. The difference is obviously the distance, which, involves a more complex support system. But the transfers of the materials, at least the sludges, has been and demonstrated throughout the life cycle of the plant. Obviously, it is like everything in Hanford, complex and more difficult than it appears on the surface, but we do have a lot of operational history over the last decades on transferring this waste in underground pipelines.
This is Max again. I'd like to ask about money, if that's something we can talk about. And specifically, is the agreement that you've come up with here, did you do a financial model to assess the levels of funding needed to hit the agreements? Do you have confidence that funding currently authorized by Congress to DOE, which is about $3 billion a year, would be sufficient to meet your milestones and meet the agreement? And if not, is there a plan in place to make sure that you're talking with the appropriators to get that money that you need?
You need to give that a shot. So, as we opened up in the briefing, we believe the department, this is a safe, realistic, and achievable course that we put into the holistic. So we do believe it's supported by an achievable funding profile, and that, our 25 request does support that. It will, over time, require, some increases of level of funding. But in our evaluation, we believe those increases are achievable, maybe not easy, but achievable, and we'll continue to work to get those. So that's kind of really where we are in the near term. And obviously moving forward, there's a lot of work and a lot of scope that we're talking about executing. And there is some additional funding needs to support that. But in general, we negotiate based on believing those are reasonable, achievable funding levels, and we have been communicating those.
So are you in coordination with Senator Murray's office, Senator Campbell's office, appropriators who would make those decisions that if you need $4 billion a year starting in 2026 or 2027 or 2028? Are those conversations ongoing right now to make sure that
not with the department? As the executive branch, we don't have direct interactions with appropriators on those topics. We do work with OMB and within the department to ensure that our commitments are reflected in the president's budget request, which goes to OMB up through the congressional delegation. But I do know that Ecology has efforts ongoing to have those discussions to ensure that the local delegations are informed of the mission needs and really the longer term play. Because again, I kind of want to remind everyone, we're talking about the tank waste mission here. There's still a broader mission at Hanford that has to take place that can't be left at the expense of the tank waste mission. And there's a balance, and that balance comes back to risk to the workers' public and environment, and determining when is the right time frame to attack these things within available resources. And that's why in my opening remarks, I talked a lot about the relationships forged here, because while this agreement is a path for our tank waste mission, there will be surprises as we continue the decades remaining on this journey, be it funding, be it technical challenges, other things that will require the parties to go back and look and say, okay, what are our priorities given this? And the ability to flex and move in the best interest of the cleanup mission is in all parties' best interest.
Just add to what Brian said for the state of Washington, since about 2021, we have been having those conversations with appropriators, with Senator Murray, Campbell, and others that have direct involvement in the Hanford budget to educate them on the funding that is needed for the cleanup site on any given federal fiscal year. And we do our best, actually, a little obvious that we work with that helps get in touch with the people that we need to be having conversations with to educate them on the Hanford cleanup, Department of Energy, and cleanups as a whole, and the funding that is needed to ensure the obligations for a compliant budget, meeting all the agreements and tripartite agreement, what that looks and answer any questions that they have for us, including on.
Okay, thank you. One short question.
Short question, okay. I'm Delmar, it's Shelley Simone. I'm thinking about the cross-site transfer lines, and I'm wondering about the need for an understanding of extent of condition of those lines. And when 7 miles, is not easy, even David City. And so if you have a goal to start utilizing, and you've got to have to understand the extent of condition and get the lines certified. Make sure they're operational. And I'm curious about when that discussion.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear but every third or fourth word. Could somebody paraphrase the question, or?
The question was on the cross-site transfer lines, and that if you want to have these operational due to not only their length, but their engineering requirements, that there has to be a need much sooner rather than later to understand their condition and what needs to be done to actually get them into operational readiness. Is that correct, Shelley? Yes, that is correct.
So I mean, in short, that's, you know, that is correct, and we'll be undergoing, and the date that we selected to make these operational were based on needing to do all that work to evaluate what we needed to do to make it operable. You know, working with the state to get them recognized as part of the DST permitting system, because they're part of the operational system, and physically be able to do that, as well as, you know, the need date for those systems. So yeah, those operations and activities are ongoing, and we'll be moving forward as we finalize these agreements.
Thank you, Delmar. Any further questions from the board? I see none. Any closing comments from the agency?
There is a chat question from Liz with some questions about the 2038 negotiations that we discussed to sort of set the milestones moving forward for pretreatment versus the high level waste facility starting up 2033 or thereabouts, and you know, a little bit of confusion about how those dates interact, which I can take a stab at if there's time.
Okay, we've got a couple minutes. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll do my best. So probably the place to start is going back to the original consent decree, which was entered in 2010. The way it was set up was to have commissioning dates for each of the 3 main facilities that make up the waste treatment plant. So the low activity waste facility, the high level waste facility, and the pretreatment facility, and then an overall date for the whole complex to start up and achieve initial operations. Energy then ran into technical issues with the pretreatment facility and to a lesser extent the high level waste facility that led us back to court in the 2010s with competing versions of how to modify the decree. And one of the outcomes of that was that the court held in place the milestones for starting up the low activity waste facility, but then moved out the dates for starting up the pretreatment facility and high level waste facility. So now you've got, you know, early mid 2020s for the low activity waste facility in a direct feed configuration, and 2033 for the other 2 facilities. So we're now at a point where we know that the pretreatment facility can't start in 2033, but we can directly basically plumb the high level waste facility to go ahead and start independent of the pretreatment facility. So that's the 2033 timeframe we've talked about, which, as Mark explained, when the critical path schedule is developed, there might be some slight adjustment of that date, but in that general timeframe is the expectation. What we've done is to say 18 months after the high level waste facility starts treating waste, we have this negotiation to fill in the dates for the remaining pretreatment functions in the consent decree, reset the dates for the entire WTP complex to be operating, which is really just saying you've filled in those final pre-treatment functions, and then reset the dates under the tri-party agreement for finishing those major activities that depend on having that waste treatment available. So getting all the tanks retrieved, closing the tank farms, and treating all the waste.
Okay,
And
thank
Andy's mentioned this before, but one other aspect to that is we think that why that's important is that at that future time, the Department, Ecology, and EPA will have a significant deal of greater information about having actually operated the low activity waste facility and the high level waste facility, being farther along, and we'll be able to use that institutional knowledge and technical knowledge to inform the negotiation that Andy's talking about the additional pre-treatment functions.
And one point to add is those pre-treatment functions will be designed to, minimize the high level waste in terms of pre-treating at sludge washings for mission duration considerations. Obviously, we'll be running the high level waste in a direct feed scenario prior to those, but it's about duration of mission and facility support that versus starting high level waste. I saw that little bit of confusion in the question there on that point.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen, for a great presentation and discussion. We will pick it up again this afternoon. We'll be talking about waste transportation and emergency preparedness issues germane to the state of Oregon. After the break, we will have representatives from the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla. Mason Murphy is here, so we'll pick up on that on the agenda at 10:30. So we're now on break.
Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Unmuted.
Hanford Site Environmental Restoration. Mr. Mason Murphy, you're up. And by the way, thank you for the tour yesterday. I think the group really appreciated that. Some of us learned something.
I learned a lot.
Great. Well, today we're going to kind of go over the big picture of why all of those things are occurring. That'll depend on presentation. Or not.
Oh, I did, just don't know why it's explained like this all of a sudden. This is why you don't be in charge of things.
And I might walk around just because I'll be just as surprised at what slides come up today as you all. So
One thing to note, as you walk around, if you keep your mouth faced towards the owl, then it'll be easier to hear.
You bet.
Why do they call it the owl?
It's got a little owl eyes on this.
Looks
I
like,
know.
it's the brand name.
It's too spooky.
All right, we'll do this one then instead. Hopefully, can everyone see this online? Oh, there you go.
Can people see this online?
We'll be sharing momentarily.
Okay,
We should run.
it should be. See Dan. Okay, great.
All right. Well, I believe we all met yesterday, but my name is Mason Murphy. I'm C2IR's Energy and Environmental Science Program Manager. And today we're going to do an overview of our environmental work at the Hanford site. We're going to look at the past at the Hanford site and some of the uses that C2IR had at the site. Then we're going to talk about some of the recent work, really from the 2010 period to today. And then we're going to look at the future, and we're going to start looking at where this work is taking us. So, and then you'll see some pictures of some of our staff doing that work. And you can see that in this picture, two of our field technicians collecting a water sample upriver of the Hanford site.
We're working on it. I touched the wrong button. I pushed enter and I didn't like it. All right.
So in the beginning, the creator asked of the creatures of the earth, who will take care of the Indian people? And it was salmon that stood and said on it. And so the tribes were both spiritually and economically connected to the Hanford Reach, especially along the river there. There were subsistence use, cultural use, and economic uses at the site. And it was a really popular wintering ground for a number of tribes, including the Umatilla. And use. Slide.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
We're gonna try something different real quick. with
That's
this.
all right.
No, change that.
Here. Bear with us, apologize.
Just made that one. CDUR. Okay, check. I will. Let's combine, and it should be here. And it is here. Okay. We are sharing and. Showing.
Mason did say he was gonna walk around, so you can.
Yeah.
Don't see it.
So you've got design, animation, price.
Hey, Just come over here. As I said, this slide's just as it is.
Mason, would you prefer this or that?
Yeah, let's do that slide. That's great. Perfect. So the first foods and their promise. So from the CTR creation belief is born the natural laws or Tamanwe, and the importance of taking care of the land to ensure that the first foods continue to take care of the Indian people. Within this promise and within this natural law, there's a reciprocity between humans and other biotic forms that arise from that creation belief. There's both a moral and a practical obligation to care for one another. And because of that, it creates ecosystem resilience. It also is informed by the spatial distribution of the serving order. And so you can see water going to fish, to big game, to roots, to berries, and finally to water. So not only does this reflect the hydrologic cycle, it also gives us an opportunity to see the importance of water and the necessity for clean water for clean first foods and thus the healthy people that depend upon it. Next slide, please. So here are a couple examples of various first foods cultural expressions. So these are some different community feasts. We have the celery feast that happens in the February timeframe. We've got the salmon feast in spring timeframe, and then the root feasts as well during that time frame, and then the huckleberry feast in the summer. We've also got community celebrations for war dances, root feasts, men's roundtable, and others. Some examples of those up there, those pictures. Thanks. And we also see some individual ceremonies, like when a young man gets his first salmon or his first kill, or when a young lady gets her first roots or first berries. And so these are some C2IR members. So the C2IR traditional use areas and the usual and the custom areas. This is an area of the historical use by C2IR where the darker areas are the more uses and the lighter areas are less uses. We talk about these locations as the usual and accustomed areas, and these are areas that have treaty resources that are documented through traditional use studies. Our Cultural Resources Protection Program does those traditional use studies. There are treaty impacts across this area, and within the treaty, the treaty rights were retained within all usual and accustomed areas to access the first foods. An example of this is in Montana for the buffalo. Some case law in Oregon and Washington for the harvest of fish in those usual and accustomed areas. And that is the USD Washington and the USD Oregon case law. You may know as the Washington one is the Volt decision. Next slide. So that brings us to the Treaty of 1855. It was the basis of government-to-government relationship between the U.S. and the CTUIR, or the Cayuse, Walla Walla, and Umatilla Bands. And in that treaty, 6.4 million acres were ceded, and 250,000 acres for reservation were retained. So you can see the Hanford site in green there, and it's blown up into the middle of the slide. And you can see the red line that demonstrates where that boundary is. That boundary talks about the Spokane River, then toward the White Bluffs. And as we all know, the tribes are in a difficult place to accept the conditions of that treaty. But in doing so, they reserve the right to hunt, fish, gather foods and medicines, and pasture animals on ceded lands and in usual and custom areas. The Treaty of 1855 remains in effect in its very recent history to the CTUI. Through a number of congressional acts and local Oregon acts, that land mass was reduced from, the reservation land was reduced from 250,000 to 172,000 acres. However, the ability to access those first foods is still present. It's a trust responsibility of the government that we seek to ensure that the federal government upholds. Slide. So treaty rights are linked to the first foods through the natural laws. These aren't necessarily the same natural laws when we think of John Locke and but they tie the first foods in the serving order to the landscape. So the first foods feasts, first you will be served water, and salmon, then deer, then the roots, and finally the berries, and then it will be followed with water. So this reflects these explicit treaty identified resources, ties that serving order to the landscape. And you can see for Chooch, or for water, we have the water rights. For Nissa, we have the fishing rights. For Yamash, we have the hunting rights. And for Couch, we have the grazing and the gathering rights. It also provides a worldview or a traditional ecological knowledge or a way of knowing and relating to the landscape. And that is reflected in that to the right, where various things are harvested, and also to that serving order. It provides a way of valuing and establishing work, right? As we recognize the value of certain rights, like water rights. And we also begin to look at the values of these additional rights, like grazing rights. Next. So first foods are at the center of the DNR, the Department of Natural Resources River and Upland Vision. These two visions together describe the necessary touchstones for ensuring that there is a functional ecosystem that supports first foods. So that departmental mission is to protect, restore, and enhance the first foods, cultural, economic, and sovereign benefit to CTUIR. We'll do this by using traditional ecological and cultural knowledge and science to inform population and habitat management goals, natural resource policies, and regulatory mechanisms. As we've discussed before, reciprocity is important in these systems, and that reciprocity leads to ecosystem resilience and can be described as the spatial distribution of the serving order and the first foods as they relate to the Treaty of 1855. So that was a look at the past. Here we'll take a look at the present. Here are a few of our scientists in the laboratory performing a number of wet chemical tests. And this section will focus on building capacity for the protection of first foods from environmental threats. You might ask, and we showed one slide where the tribes have been involved at the site because of the treaty. You might ask, what are some other reasons the tribes are involved with the Hanford site? One of them is because of those ceded lands from the Treaty of 1855, which we should have shown. The other is the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. CTR is documented as an affected Indian tribe. CERCLA and Superfund, both the cleanup and remediation, as well as the natural resource restoration work. We put together a Hanford policy that was approved by DOT resolution that seeks to bring the Hanford site to pre-1855 conditions or equivalent and to protect the river. We also seek to become long-term partners and co-managers in that, and that's important because it ensures that when the Hanford site funding is no longer available and the site has been returned to local ownership, that we continue to steward that land as has been done for thousands of years prior. Here's a copy out of one of our place names atlas, this picture. This picture shows many of the cultural sites along the Hanford Reach, and you can see that they are numerous. This book is available for purchase at the gift shop. Should you want to see more about some of the other maps that include the more southern portion. The Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act allowed for the tribes to begin to contract with the federal government, and the Department of Energy Environmental Management Program has a cooperative agreement with CTUIR, of which we developed this work. So CTR Hanford, related activities toward long-term stewardship. We have a field station laboratory. And we have a couple of greenhouses that we utilize for botanical mitigation and first foods research. We use the laboratory for environmental monitoring and environmental research and methods developed. We also review and comment on the cleanup process through NEPA and RCRA. We've been tracking and supporting the offsite grouting initiative through the testbed initiative. With a key caveat that we'd like to see those wastes grouted at or near the site prior to shipment. And we want to ensure that the tribal subsistence scenarios, which are our own risk-based scenarios on potential future uses of the site, be included in all the CERCLA risk assessments. In the 2010 baseline river corridor risk assessment, these tribal subsistence scenarios were used by the Hanford site, and Yakima's subsistence scenario was also used separately. We have a cultural resource protection program that monitors the National Historic Preservation Act compliance. And we are involved in natural resource damage assessment at the trustee council. And I am our senior trustee. First foods research is necessary for us to understand the impacts to trust resources from Hanford contamination. We are doing some of that work now to further strengthen some of the transfer factors, for instance, from radionuclides and the fate and transport of those into first foods. We're also looking at implementing additional methods that we can utilize to ensure that certain areas like upwelling sites that are impacted from the Hanford site are able to be protected and monitored long term. And ultimately, this is all towards the focus of restoring and enhancing those first foods and protecting them. So here's a little timeline from about 1997 when the first tribal subsistence scenario was published till today. Throughout 2003 and 2010, there were some ongoing negotiations to develop long-term stewardship or legacy management capacity at CTYR. We developed and adopted our CTYR policy, a Hanford policy in 2006. From 2007 to 2011, we utilized the tribal subsistence scenario into the river, along with DOE, into the river corridor baseline risk assessment. 2011 to 2015, we constructed the field station and optimized the systems. Those include all of the standard operating procedures. In 2016, some of the first Hanford plants run at the field station and the laboratory methods for metal analysis were developed. By 2017, we obtained laboratory accreditation through the Oregon Laboratory Accreditation Program, which is certified by the NELAC Institute. Primary accrediting agency for environmental laboratories, and they developed their systems towards a standard known to laboratories as the ISO 17025 or the calibration laboratory standards. In 2018, we put together tribal Hanford access and sampling protocols and agreements, and those were completed at the end of 2019. 2019, we also completed a 100F risk assessment and developed the risk calculator off of that. We also put together some CalCup models to understand how the waste treatment plant would impact nearby and offsite resources. In 2019, we began to look at an artificial muscle ion exchange-based cumulative sampler and perform studies to understand strontium and uranium uptake in those samples. We currently have an agreement or a strategic partnership with PNNL to further this work. And in 2021, we hired, well, actually, we'll go rewind real quick. In 2017, we also started the development of our tribal member scientist training pathway. The pathway that we put together to ensure that we had the ability to hire tribal members from the community and train them to ensure that we had a long-term capacity at the Hanford site. Key element of that Hanford policy. And so here in 2021, we hired our first tribal member intern now as a chemist and trained him up through the EESP scientist training track. I think many of you met Lauren in the laboratory. And so I think maybe can attest to the vast amount of knowledge he's gained through his internships with us. We've also expanded on this program and begun to work with Oregon State University to allow Lauren to get his PhD while working on our scope of work at the Hanford site, but while still working for us and ensuring that that work is completed for the C2I. This was a huge step for us in that scientist training track pathway, and one I think that we will continue to build on in the coming years.
If I can ask you real quick. Yeah. On that pathway, are you also paying for the tuition for those folks to get selected?
No, thankfully, the Oregon has a tribal grants, a tribal Oregon grant. So if you attend an Oregon college, they pay your tuition and your living expenses. And so we've encouraged our students to utilize that process.
Just through graduate school as well.
Through graduate school as well. We can get it from undergrad to PhD at this point. So we've been pretty successful in ensuring that our students go those routes. If they don't go that, we've also developed a technician training track. Importance of the technician training was that we recognized that some folks didn't need to be have a PhD or a master's or a bachelor's in science to be effective lab technicians. And so we've also begun that development and have several technicians right now hired that C2IR tribal members that are working through their training. In 2022, we sampled the Columbia River at the Hanford Reach to develop a Columbia River matrix for laboratory ion exchange test. What that is, it's a simulant of the Columbia River that we can utilize to test our ion exchange materials to ensure that the artificial mussels are able to detect the contaminants in that particular area in the Hanford Reach, because the laboratory tests work well, but unfortunately the laboratory tests are very specific to a neutral pH water that does not have any of the co-competing ions that we see at the Hanford Reach. And then in 2023, we developed and implemented our first sampling and analysis plans for the first foods. We did this at the Wanakit site. We went off of the Hanford site, and you saw that I mentioned we developed those sampling protocols for the Hanford site. We utilized those and developed this sampling and analysis plan. The big reason why we didn't do this originally at the Hanford site is because one, we didn't want to concern them too much with the fact that this is the first time we're doing this. And so we wanted a test site. The Wanakit site is a C2IR owned site just downriver from the Hanford site. And so it has a very similar set of soils and plant communities. And then this year, we proposed a Hanford solar and storage proposal in the Hanford industrial lands and the C2R seeded lands, consistent with the carbon-free energy leasing effort and the Department of Energy's Clean Up to Clean Energy mantra. So this is currently where we're at, and we are looking forward to seeing how that shapes up. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about our tribal member scientist and technician training beyond what we've already discussed. Here are a number of our interns at various levels and technicians. Our scientist training track is really the professional development of our tribal members to become scientists. We have opportunities for high school students, for undergraduate students, for graduate students, and finally we've got this PhD track that has just opened up for Lauren on the right in the middle there. And we also have our technician training track. It's a non-degree pathway to develop the technical competence in environmental sciences. And the young lady on the right, Deshawn Dick, she is one of those technicians and has done an exceptional job. And I anticipate that she will continue to grow in this field. We've also done some botanical restoration and some research. Here's the Pacific Northwest Site Office for the Protected Designation Area. This is just northeast of the PNNL campus, right along the river there. There's a little uranium plume not too far from there underneath. Hopefully we'll capture some of that in the saving run. Just kidding, we'll see it. I don't think we're looking at that, but. So we did a number of things. We developed soil and moisture sensors to automate our greenhouse irrigation. We produced roughly 40,000 plants in fiscal year 17. We planted approximately 12 acres of this land. Produced a number of seedlings. Have continued to our ongoing cheatgrass trial. We all recognize the negative impacts of cheatgrass on the site and on the ecosystem in general, and the need to improve that. So we consider that one of the environmental contaminant threats that we think we need to address and deal with. We did some seeding trials at our field station to understand first foods. And some of those seeding trials were to understand how Sandberg's bluegrass, Poa secunda, could help control cheatgrass. We are planning to propose some changes to the restoration manual to ensure that we increase the number of Sandberg bluegrass seeding to ensure that we reduce fire risk from that cheatgrass in the long term. Some cactus tests were completed in fiscal year 21 at this site that you see here, and also under our solar panels and at our field station to understand the impacts of both the solar panels and the cheatgrass. And then we have been working towards some research to understand how to improve overall restoration of the shrub steppe species that support first foods. So we're no longer laboratory accredited. In 2019, much of our staff members that we had at the time, many were non-tribal members and moved on to work at the Hanford site. And some of them moved on to work in the energy field. So from 2019 on, we began restaffing. But at the time, this demonstrated that we had the ability with the quality systems and the processes that we had developed, those standard operating procedures, to obtain and retain accreditation through that period of time. And here's one of our interns assisting with the pipeline operations to ensure traceability. We talked about the tribal risk calculator and the importance of that. To do that, we developed a GIS display that took the concentrations of various samples that had been collected at the Hanford site and reported at the Hanford site. And we assigned some risk to those based on the tribal subsistence scenario and had put together an ability to display that risk for the 100 F area. So through the natural resource damage assessment, we're obviously involved to look at a number of assessments here. Some work that we are will be starting here very shortly is a hyper-reach study of the Hanford Reach at the Columbia River. And we're hoping to demonstrate potential river impacts to upwelling and benthic organisms, which ultimately at least two of those benthic organisms, two families of those benthic organisms are first foods, and many of the other first foods depend upon those organisms. No, this is for the reach, the river reach. Slide. So some access and sampling protocols. We developed these protocols to access the Hanford site. We also developed some sampling documents that were prepared to comply with those NELAC Institute standards. And then, as I mentioned, we performed last year our first sampling and analysis plan for the first foods at that test site in Wanakit. And we did so to ensure that the protocols were effective. We did that again this year and are currently working with Pacific Northwest National Laboratories to build internal capacity on some of the methods that we hope to utilize in the long term. And we are also working to, as an organization, acquire the former Umatilla Chemical Depot lands, at least a portion of those lands. And there are several circular remedies intact on those lands. And those circular remedies will give us an opportunity to demonstrate our ability to do long-term stewardship and to grow that capacity around first foods access, sampling, and long-term management of the circular remedies. Next slide. So that was a look at the past. Here's a look at the future. So CTR's vision for future management of the Hanford lands includes our definition of long-term stewardship. We also have a vision for that long-term stewardship. Ultimately, we'd like to return to our former role of the stewards of those land and resources. And our commitment to DOE for those that for long-term stewardship is that we'll continue to work to become long-term partners and managers of all the lands and resources at Hanford. And we will work collaboratively and respectfully with all those parties involved and prudently use that funding provided by the U.S. Department of Energy to meet those goals and our own policy goals. So we have an end state vision for the Hanford site. That is clean, restored, protected, enhanced, and accessible. Clean being below our own health standards, consistent with that tribal subsistence scenario. Restored, ensuring that the ecosystem services and the equivalency of those services are restored. Protected, ensuring that it's permanently protecting the quality and quantity of both cultural and natural resources. That is enhanced for the continual improvement in the quality and quantity of accessible natural resources at the site. And that it is safe and open access by CTR members for the use of those traditional lands and resources throughout the site. Also, we've defined that Hanford should not be further developed unless explicitly done through government-to-government consultation. We should get the first right of refusal should land become available within that ceded territory. And then we'll continue to work towards becoming long-term partners on the site. We'll continue to be proactively engaged in managing the natural and cultural resources at the site or affected by the site. Our end state vision for management of the Hanford lands is consistent with the closure of the 7th generation report. This is the 2017 edition that was presented to the State and Tribal Government Working Group. We would like to be the long-term partners and managers of all the lands and resources at the Hanford site to ensure that the federal government upholds its trust responsibility, participate in this long-term, multi-generational mission, and that we try to get most of the long-term stewardship concepts consistent between the Department of Energy's Hanford Long-Term Stewardship Program Plan, which has some differences between that plan and the closure for the 7th generation. And it's important to have those similar in the conceptual model and for DOE to utilize those tribal viewpoints and to prioritize access and use. To somebody's question earlier, we use this.
Mason, a question before you move on. The concept of first right of refusal, CTUIR versus Yakima Nest first. How does that?
Oh, we'll probably negotiate that. But Yakima has ceded territories as well to the west, CTUIR to the east. And some of those likely overlap as the treaty writer or the writers of the treaty were less precise, I think, than they could have been. And I think there was also a benefit to the U.S. government to ensure that there was potentially infighting. I mean, that's just what we know from history. So when we look at the river vision and the upland vision describes how the big game roots and berries are impacted and the touchstones to improve them. here we're looking at the river vision and the water and fish as critical to the river vision. Within that river vision, there are 5 touchstones. That's hydrology, geomorphology, connectivity, riparian vegetation, and biota. So I've changed these restoration actions to be largely based on ones that are at the Hanford site. Anything from hydro-ops changes to affect the hydrology and the discharge and flow velocity of the site, to contamination source removal, which we think would improve both the geomorphology, the connectivity, and the biota of the site. And then improvements with riparian vegetation by planting native species. So these touchstones are important in this vision, and they're ones that we can monitor with a variety of potential monitoring methods. Anything metals testing. As I addressed earlier, we had received that accreditation prior, and that was for these metal testing capabilities. And we will continue to build capacity within those types of analyses. And there are a number of other potential monitoring methods that we could employ to demonstrate that these touchstones are being improved. Next slide. Here's our vision for the future management of the Hanford lands. This is what we believe as the first foods management strategy. So when the Department of Energy certifies that the lands are clean and ready for use, we'll go and put together our own data review package where we look at both the resource, the botanical resource restoration, contamination of the resource, the botanical resource restoration, the risk analysis associated with the use of this, and then any potential injury assessments. So as I mentioned prior, we developed that first sample analysis plan for First Foods. That would be followed by a review and approval and conducting of the sampling and analysis activities. We finally review and validate that data until we had tribally accepted environmental data. We all know, or those of you involved in data know, it's important that we have data that has the necessary quality reviews to ensure that it is both legally defensible and traceable. We will also utilize that data to inform restoration planning and develop botanical stocks consistent with that planning to restore those resources. Also use our conceptual land use models and the risk tools that we've developed to understand what type of decision should be, or what type of control should be implemented at the site, whether that be unrestricted access, which is, as we all know, a little unlikely in many areas, institutional controls, which the federal agencies generally define as fences and security. We have some additional ideas behind that. We will also look at potentially doing future cleanup, further cleanup, and or storing and monitoring the resources. Many of the lost uses will be defined, and then there will be compensation to restore those, or compensatory restoration completed to ensure the equivalency of those restorations. And we see this as our tribal role in both resource monitoring, natural resource management, cultural and historic management, cultural and historic resource management, and ultimately this is what we term as long-term stewardship. So what does the future look like? The future, we will continue developing our first food sampling and analysis plans. There's one to the right here, you can see. It is for the sampling of the Puntia columbiana and soils at the Wanakit site. We're looking to expand that in the near term to the Hanford site. Our wildlife program has mentioned an interest in following Yakima in their elk hunt. And so we would be ready to work alongside the DOE and Yakima to sample those first foods resources. We also have some research goals, both contaminant, bait, and transport, analytical method development, ion exchange-based passive sampler development, and research toward the reduction of invasive species and improvement of restoration processes and protocols. We are currently engaged in a toxics reduction to the Columbia River grant with the EPA. In our 2026 through 2030 timeframe with the Hanford site, we plan to incorporate the Hanford environmental inventory into this process. And we will continue our first foods resource restoration work as available. We have a bit of mitigation funding remaining from a prior mitigation agreement at the Pacific Northwest Site Office Preservation Designated Area. All the PNSO PEA area from now on. And then we ultimately will want to develop a CTR Hanford conceptual site model that we can use to inform our end state for RCRA, CERCLA, and NEPA. Those of you familiar with those acts recognize the importance of having a conceptual site model to ensure that the standards used and the processes are aligned with the ultimate goal of the end use of the site. Is all I've got for you folks today. Here's some of my contact info. I thank you for your time. I thank you all for coming and touring our laboratory with us. And here are some of our CTR member staff that have made this work possible. So I'm happy to take any questions.
I have some questions. Oh, sorry. Good question.
So I know that there's been work by CTYR on environmental DNA testing for fish in the river. So environmental DNA, for anyone who doesn't know, is grab samples of the environment from water usually, and then testing for DNA in that water sample to determine what organisms are in the area. And it's a good way to sort of just get a presence absence of organisms in the area. Is that work done in your lab, or is that through the hatchery?
That work is being done with our mussel and lamprey program, which is within fisheries.
Right.
We've actually been in discussions with them about utilizing our artificial mussel ion exchange-based passive sampler. But we are still doing some testing to validate those methods before we allow them to be used for those purposes. But they're currently doing some of the eDNA work, and we've had them engage with EPA Region 10 laboratory, who also does some of that work. And so we're looking forward to seeing how that shapes up, and if that's a tool that we want to utilize for presence absence of some of these benthic organisms at the Hanford site in the future.
Can you describe your land back program?
We have a realty group that works to acquire lands and then place them back into trust with the federal government. Depending on how that happens, if the land is in federal ownership, like many of the DOE lands, they could be transferred directly into trust. In cases like the Army Depot, that was transferred to a reuse authority first, and that reuse authority will be transferring a portion of that land to the CTYR, and from that, it'll be about a 4 to 5 year process to transfer that into trust land. Prior to it going into trust, there will be taxes, et cetera, required for those. And once the trust designation is set, then the land will be available for many of the potential uses dictated by some of the long-term stewardship, access, and use policies that we've set for certain sites.
What is the Umatilla Chemical Depot?
Oh, that's a great question. So there is a site just west of Permiston that was used, first it was the Army depot where a number of munitions were stored. It later turned into the chemical depot where we began to store much of the sarin and other mustard gases. And when you drive on 84, you'll see it's got a bunch of bunkers that are covered in shrubstead. And it's a pretty large site. It's one of the largest remaining shrubstead sites of that type in Oregon, along with the Boardman bombing range. And it is a site that had some, rather than nuclear waste, it had several munitions types of waste, including TNT. And one of the large cleanups there is actually pump and treat for removal of TNT. So there are some washout lagoons that the Army, the Oregon Military Department, and EPA and Oregon DEQ work to ensure that the CERCLA remedies at that site are complete according to CERCLA. And there's also the portion of the site that we would look to retain as an active, well, as a past landfill and a number of other CERCLA remedied sites. Some of those remedies are simply don't touch it and monitor it quarterly. And then we have 5-year reviews that will be the CERCLA 5-year reviews will continue per CERCLA.
There's a question online, if you're willing to share the slide deck presentation on our website.
Sure.
Okay.
Mason, you talked about, thanks for all this context. The tribal subsistence scenario. Can you explain a little more what that means and why it matters?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So at some point, we recognized that many of, for instance, the fish consumption rates in Washington are significantly below what the average consumption rates are for tribal members. We also recognize that there are a number of uses of the site and water at the site that, or at any site, for instance, for sweat purposes or spiritual purposes and or for economic purposes and or specifically for subsistence purposes. So many of these foods have a lot lower consumption rates dictated by the state, and the state then dictates its pollution permits. Colloquial term there, pollution permits, pollution prevention permits. And it dictates those based on many of those consumption rates. And so what the tribal subsistence scenario seeks to do is it seeks to define what the ideal consumption rates are for a number of these types of species and foods, so that we can, to some degree, figure out what that regulatory process will look like. Especially when it comes to CERCLA, we see that the cleanup levels are often dictated, right, by what the future use of the site is. And in this case, we're saying, well, we will be using the site in the future for the gathering of some of these foods and medicines. And in doing so, we want to ensure that the cleanup levels are to the level necessary to allow that type of use.
Okay, thank you, Mason. Got one more question. Thank you. Talk about this. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, Mason. The solar project development at the site that clean up the clean energy process. How is that aligned with the CTUR's vision for sort of CTUR management first and not doing further development at the site unless you're involved? So you may look at that as maybe a contradiction that, okay, you're also supporting development of something else right now that's not under your ownership. How do you align those two, that idea?
Yeah, so when the Department of Energy put out a request for information, we followed that up with a response that was essentially, while we don't support this, if you're going to do this anyways, we'd like to ensure that we do this first, right? Part of that first right of refusal. So really this was somewhat of a complex policy analysis with our existing Hanford policy to ensure that, and many of the comments that we suggested to DOE were that, for instance, these energy systems must be, that the site where they are installed must be returned to the pre-1855 conditions or equivalent after that is complete, or after the project is done, but before the final cleanup is complete. So it hinges on much of our Hanford policy and the importance of ensuring that the site is returned to some of those pre-1855 conditions.
So maybe I can synthesize my mind, if you will, that the time, because the Hanford cleanup is so long, setting up the sidebar, and maybe the unofficial word is 2100 on like day before cleanup is done. That between now and then, you would be comfortable to some degree with the solar project or some other type of energy generation project for a period of time, then removing that after it's been useful life is done, and the land can still be further cleaned up and returned to truck use or whatever the scenario might be.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. I got a quick question. Mason, on the Army depot, right, you have the collapse of the burrowing owls and the restoration of them. Kind of looking at things holistically, and I'm not sure if they're on the Hanford side, but has the tribes considered doing like a goal-wide protection of the burrowing owls as it, that transitions?
From to the Hanford site?
No, yeah, on the Army depot.
Oh, we have been working, our wildlife program manages most of that, and they have been working closely with the OWL project. And they do plan to continue that work and to ensure that the burrowing owls are to continue to be supported at that site. I hope that answered your question.
So on that last point about Harvard development, wants to take up the triangle, have you all been consulted regarding the build of the small modular reactors in the 25 minute?
Yeah, that's definitely a contentious piece, I think, because obviously we recognize the use of the Climate Commitment Act funds there. While I think the big key is that our energy policy and our Hanford policy, along with the Cryptic Energy Vision, which if you don't have a copy of that, I can get anyone that would like want a copy of that Cryptic Energy Vision, and that's one in which we've adopted for guiding our engagement of energy activities within the ceded lands and the usual and accustomed areas. But in general, we have had these discussions between the Department of Energy and our Board of Trustees. Because this project has not reached the point where it is a proposed project, the government-to-government consultations have ceased from what the original proposal was, and we'll re-engage on that once we have an understanding of what the actual proposed project is. Does that answer your question?
Okay. I was just going to note on the acronym, you said the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission.
Correct.
Okay.
Thanks, Max. Yeah.
Okay. We're going to take an unscheduled 10-minute break for those of us who didn't check out. So if we can reconvene in 10 minutes, again, thanks. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, y'all.
Yeah.